Wonderhussy here, hiking around the middle of nowhere in the desert just east of Death Valley, kind of in the mountains between the town of Shoshone, California, and the town of Pahrump, Nevada. And you can see there's a whole lot of nothing out here. So why am I hiking around out here, you might wonder? Well, I'm hiking to this thing that I found about 3 years ago, and I never bothered to make a video about it because I didn't really think it was exciting enough. But recently somebody gave me a tip that made me think that it might actually be something very interesting. Okay, like I said, I'm just outside the eastern boundary of Death Valley National Park, and I'm hiking to check out what I think might be a campsite of the Ballarat Bandit. Okay, if you've never heard of the Ballarat Bandit, it's kind of a legendary, almost kind of like Robin Hood type figure. Basically, he was a fugitive from the law that hid out in Death Valley National Park for over a year. He was being chased by the cops for over a year back in 2003, 2004. And he was really wily. He was able to survive off the land. And you know, this isn't an easy landscape to survive off of without any supplies, which is probably why he resorted to petty thievery. Okay, the way the police became aware of this Ballarat Bandit is a bunch of petty thefts were reported in the area around Ballarat Ghost Town. If you've ever been to Ballarat Ghost Town, it's way over on the other side of Death Valley National Park. It's a real funky little old ghost town. They shot one of the scenes in that movie Easy Rider there. There's an old jail that supposedly Charles Manson carved his name into. And I've made bunches of videos in Ballarat because I was friends with the caretaker at that time, this really cool guy named Rock Novak. Used to live out there. Wonderful man. But like I was saying, there really isn't much to the town of Ballarat other than this old jail and a few other crumbling old relics from, oh gosh, I guess the late 1800s, which is when Ballarat was an actual town. You know, it was one of those classic mining towns. It was named after another mining town called Ballarat in Australia, but Ballarat, California was never that big. Only about 500 people at its peak. But apparently back in 2003, there was a general store there. And if you go there today, there is a general store, but it's not really a store. You know, you can buy sodas and Cliff Bars, but that's about it. Well, apparently 20 years ago, it was an actual store. And one night it was burgled and $4,000 worth of stuff was stolen. Okay, that's a lot of money for a small country general store. I guess there was a quad, an ATV that was stolen, and that was probably the bulk of that $4,000 worth of stuff, but also some canned goods, some gasoline, ammunition, stuff like that. Stolen from Rock Novak. He was living out there at the time. Woke up one morning and his quad was gone. Noticed some of his supplies were missing. So he called the sheriff, filed a report, but they really couldn't do anything about it because, yeah, you could see the ATV tracks from the quad going off into the mountains. But again, if you've ever been to Ballarat, it sits at the base of the Panamint mountain range, and that's a huge mountain range that rises very dramatically. Gosh, I want to say 10,000 feet high. And that mountain range is full of canyons with old mines and old cabins and all kinds of hidey holes where a bandit who had just stolen an ATV could disappear. And that's exactly what happened. He just disappeared into the mountains, and the sheriff, you know, looked around, scratched his head. Well, sorry, Rock. We'll keep an eye out for your quad, but there's really not much we can do. And it went on like that for, gosh, I think like over the next month or so, there was a couple other thefts. People camping nearby had their supplies stolen, their water stolen, you know, petty annoyance type stuff. There was no violence. He wasn't killing anybody. He was just stealing supplies so that he could continue to live off-grid in Death Valley, which again is a very inhospitable environment. Anyway, there had been a number of thefts reported, so law enforcement was kind of on the lookout. They knew there was some guy hiding up in the mountains that was stealing stuff, but couldn't catch him. Well, then one day, a group of off-duty police officers, I think from LA, happened to be hiking in Death Valley, you know, just taking a nice hike on their day off. And they ran into this dude with a quad that was piled high with survival supplies. You know, jugs of water, gas, tarps, clothing, was a shotgun, I think, laid across the top. And they kind of thought that was weird, you know, being law enforcement, their spidey senses activated. And so they struck up a conversation with the guy, and he said, "Oh yeah, I'm just here for an overnight camping trip." And they thought that was pretty weird, because who goes for an overnight camping trip with a quad fully loaded with all that gear? Not very many people. And then the fact that there was a shotgun across the top of it, well, one of the cops, as they were leaving, decided to turn around and take a picture. He took a picture of this guy, and to this day that remains the only photograph of the Ballarat Bandit. Of course, they didn't know it was the Ballarat Bandit. They just thought there was something fishy about this guy and that they'd better take a picture of him. Whew, getting out of breath, hiking up this old Jeep trail. We're hiking into a canyon there in these mountains. I guess you used to be able to drive up this road, but it's marked wilderness now. And unlike the Ballarat Bandit, I am a law-abiding citizen, so I needed exercise anyway. I'm just hiking up. Anyway, back to the story. Now they had this photo, and so they took it to these cops, these off-duty cops, took it to the Inyo County Sheriff's Department, because Death Valley and Ballarat is in Inyo County, California. Cops took this picture over and said, "Hey, we ran into this kind of fishy character while we were out in the mountains over the weekend. Thought you might be interested." Boy, were they interested. They knew right away. They go, "I'll bet you anything that's the Ballarat Bandit," because the quad was right there. They probably confirmed with Rock Novak, "Is that your quad?" "Oh, yeah, that's it." Well, now they knew their guy was out there, but they still couldn't track him down. I mean, it takes a very special kind of person to be able to disappear into a landscape like this and hide out for weeks, months on end. But that's exactly what this guy was doing. And I really, really hate a thief. But I actually have a measure of respect for this Ballarat Bandit, because he was able to survive in this landscape for as long as he did. I mean, this hunt for him went on for, I think, almost a year. But the cops never could catch him. And it became a pretty big story, bizarrely. Even though, okay, some guy stole a quad and some cans of beans. What's the big deal? Well, remember, this was 2003, 2004, not that long after 9/11. And so I guess law enforcement was sort of on high alert, and they actually thought that the guy might be some kind of terrorist, which I know sounds absolutely bizarre to me. Like, what kind of Al-Qaeda terrorist is hanging out in the Panamint Mountains stealing quads and cans of, pork and beans? But again, they were, on high alert. 9/11 did a lot of things to a lot of people, and so, man, there was this huge manhunt for him, but they couldn't seem to catch him. And so now the press, the newspapers, kind of started making fun of him. Like, "Ooh, the Ballarat Bandit escapes again. He's too wily for the cops." Everybody loves that. Well, I wouldn't really call it a Robin Hood story, because he wasn't giving to the poor. And he wasn't even stealing from the rich. Rock Novak is hardly rich, but, he wasn't hurting anybody. And he was outsmarting the man. And, well, there's a lot of people who just get some satisfaction in that kind of a story. Okay, we're coming up on the mouth of this canyon, where I think one of the campsites for the Ballarat Bandit might be. And I know you're probably thinking, well, Ballarat's over on the west side of Death Valley. Why would he have been way over here outside the eastern boundary of Death Valley? Well, I'm glad you asked. So apparently the heat was on after those cops identified the guy in the picture or showed the sheriff the picture. They went after him with all their resources. I mean, they had Black Hawk helicopters, cops mounted on horseback, probably had dogs and motorcycle cops, like the whole 9 yards, going after this guy who was just committing petty thefts. And they went all over the mountains, and they never could catch him. They almost got him one time. I guess they came up on one of his campsites way at the top of Goler Wash. Okay, Goler Canyon is the southernmost canyon in the Panamint Mountains, and at the very top of that is the infamous Barker Ranch. Okay, we're finally in some shade under this outcropping. Whew, let's take a break for a minute. It's kind of a spooky cave here. It's a great place to take a break, especially when you're talking about Barker Ranch, which, if you don't know, is the hideout where the infamous Manson family lived out in Death Valley. It's actually where they were eventually apprehended. Way up in that canyon, Goler Canyon, at the very top. Well, the Ballarat Bandit had some campsite up there. The cops managed to track his ATV all the way to the site. And this time they almost caught him. I guess they came up on him, but at the last minute, he heard something and he just took off sprinting over the top of the pass, which if you've ever been to the top of Goler Canyon, there's a real gnarly pass at the top, and it opens up into this huge, vast valley called Butte Valley that stretches on forever and is one of the most desolate places in the lower 48 United States. Well, this dude just took off sprinting right across Butte Valley, and the cops took off after him, and they went flat out sprinting for like a quarter of a mile before they ran out of gas. Like, oh, I can't run anymore. So they thought, okay, we'll go back to the Jeep and we'll cut around the other way and we'll head him off the other side. And so they went back to the Jeep, but every time they looked back over their shoulder, the dude was still sprinting. And so they estimate he flat out ran about 5 miles and disappeared again. You know, this dude just had an uncanny ability to disappear into the desert, almost like a wild animal. And I guess that's part of why the cops suspected that he might be some kind of terrorist. They thought he might even be some kind of special forces guy, you know, that lost it and went over to the dark side, because he was really physically fit. I mean, he blasted across Butte Valley running for 5 miles, but he was also really good at surviving in these harsh conditions and avoiding detection. You know, apparently most of his camps were really hard to find because, you know, he would sweep over his ATV tracks. He didn't leave any traces behind. Any place that he broke in and stole stuff, he didn't leave any fingerprints. He didn't leave any evidence behind. And apparently he was stealing quite a bit of supplies. I mean, he needed to feed himself this whole time. I mean, he had a shotgun, but there's not much game to be had out here in this kind of country. I mean, you'd be lucky to maybe catch like a jackrabbit. So in order to keep himself going, he needed to find some kind of sustenance. And so I think what he ended up doing was he probably broke into a lot of these volunteer cabins that are squirreled away all over in these desert canyons, especially in the Panamint Mountains behind Ballarat. Each one of those canyons in the Panamints has at least 1 or 2 little old mining cabins, like prospectors' cabins, that volunteers have gone in and fixed up, and you can stay the night in them, you know, take shelter if you need shelter. And they're all stocked with, most of them are stocked with canned food or some kind of supplies. I've made a bajillion videos in these different cabins. I love finding these cabins. And you know how I do. I always open the cupboard and look to see what's inside. Like, oh, well, let's see. If we were stuck here tonight, what could we have for dinner? Well, the Ballarat Bandit wasn't just goofing around. He had no choice but to eat what was in those cupboards for dinner. But anyway, after the cops stumbled on his campsite at the top of Goler Wash, I think he felt like the heat was on him too much over on that side of Death Valley. So he did. He came all the way over here to the eastern side of Death Valley, which is why I'm out here in the desert between Shoshone and Pahrump, poking around this strange, desolate, lonely little canyon, because I happen to have stumbled upon a campsite here. Okay, like I said, this was 3 years ago. I was driving from Shoshone to Pahrump to run some errands with a friend, and we decided to just get out and go for a hike, a random hike, because there is this old decommissioned Jeep track leading off, you know, into this valley. We thought, well, where there's a Jeep track, it usually leads to some kind of mining camp or some old mill or something. Let's go check it out and see what we can find. And so we came up here and stumbled upon this super creepy campsite. Okay, look at this. Very rough-hewn, sort of stacked rock walls forming a very, very rough approximation of a shelter. Pretty creepy. And we'll go in and take a look at what's inside that cabin shelter in a minute. But back to the Ballarat Bandit. So he fled over here to the east side of Death Valley to get away from the heat. And while he was over here in Nye County, Nevada, he burgled some more ranches to steal more supplies, gas for his quad, drinking water. They found a couple of his campsites right outside Area 51. He went pretty far. I mean, Area 51 is pretty many miles that way to the east. So this dude ranged pretty far in that quad. But anyway, they found these campsites that they somehow could tell were his right outside Area 51. And one of the campsites, they found a military map showing all the military installations in the area. And so, you know, having this post 9/11 mindset, right away they were like, oh gosh, this guy is definitely a domestic terrorist. We really gotta get him now. Okay, I'm not sure how I feel about that. There's a lot of military installations out here, you know, Edwards, China Lake, Nellis, Creech, Area 51. There's just a lot of army bases out here, so I don't know, it doesn't seem that weird that somebody would have a map showing them, but to the cops, that was just one more red flag that they really needed to catch this guy. But unfortunately, the Ballarat Bandit was too wily for him again. I guess he stole a Subaru, of all things, somewhere in Nye County, and he used that to flee back into Death Valley. Now, you'd think, why would he go back into Death Valley when he knew the cops were looking for him out there? I think he felt safe in Death Valley because he probably knew it pretty well. I think he'd been living out there for probably at least a year before he started doing these burglaries and before they cottoned on to him. So he knew all the little canyons and caves and hidey holes and all the jeep trails leading off to nowhere. I guess he felt like it was a good place for him to go disappear. So he did. He took the Subaru and disappeared. And the cops were left scratching their heads again until one day there was this cop patrolling Death Valley in late July. Okay, late July, Death Valley. It was probably like 157 degrees outside. This guy was cruising around Johnson Canyon. Okay, Johnson Canyon is one of the canyons on the east slope of the Panamint Mountains. Well, this cop was going up Johnson Canyon one evening, and he saw an old yellow flatbed truck parked at the bottom with ramps coming off the back of the truck, like somebody had unloaded a quad. And so, you know, his spidey senses activated, like, a quad, huh? What if it's a Ballarat Bandit? Went up to the old yellow truck, looked around, there was nobody in it. There were some buckets with marijuana seedlings in them underneath the truck. And then I guess when he opened the truck, he found some identification in there belonging to the person who had owned the stolen Subaru. So he figured, aha, this is definitely the Ballarat Bandit. I'm not letting him get away this time. But unfortunately, he didn't have any backup with him, and he had no means of radioing for backup. I guess he didn't have a walkie-talkie. So he had to go back and get backup. And so to make sure the Ballarat Bandit didn't escape again, I guess he went under the hood of the truck and like took some wires out or something, disabled the truck, and went off on his way to get his backup. But then when he got back, guess what? The Ballarat Bandit wasn't there. You could tell he'd been there. He'd come back to the truck because the cop had left the car door open. Well, the door had been kicked shut. You could see a footprint on the car door. So now they had a footprint for the Ballarat Bandit, and they had that photo the off-duty cops had taken, but they weren't any closer to catching him. He had just disappeared up Johnson Canyon, and gosh, if I know the Ballarat Bandit, he probably went up and over the top, because I think there used to be a road that went all the way to the top over Johnson Canyon and into Panamint City, ghost town. So golly, maybe he went into Panamint City. Who knows? All I know is he disappeared again, and now the cops were really pissed, frankly, and embarrassed because the papers were just laughing at all this. Like, these guys can't catch this. It's just one dude living out in Death Valley, living off the land. I mean, it's gotta be pretty easy to run this guy down. But they just couldn't do it because he really did have almost a special forces-like ability to disappear into and live off of this rugged, harsh, unforgiving landscape. I mean, if you've ever been to Death Valley, I don't need to tell you, like, there's hardly anything to eat. There's even less to drink. It's blazing hot in the summer. It's freezing cold in the winter. There aren't exactly any soft beds to sleep on. This guy was almost superhuman in his ability to survive in these situations. Okay, let's take a look at this cabin that I am proposing might be a campsite of the Ballarat Bandit from his Nye County period. Okay, so you can see it's very rough, stacked rock walls built right up against this massive formation, which is a blessing because it provides some shade. You know, out here, this would have been, I think it was like June when he was out here in Nye County. It would have been very hot, well over 100 degrees, and you would have needed whatever shade you could get. And I'm guessing these rock walls were probably already here. It must have been some old prospector's camp or something. But the fact that it was, you know, it was already a kind of a shelter built in the shade, it was probably a godsend for him. And so he came in and he made some improvements. We'll go in the door here and you can see he probably stole some 2x4s, some lumber from some nearby ranches, stole this big tarp, rigged up the tarp, had some shade over the top. You know, use your imagination. Put on your imagination cap for a minute and imagine, picture you're this guy who's running from the police. You've been on the lam for many months and they're hot on your trail and they think you're a terrorist and they have the whole Department of Homeland Security after you. I'm not kidding, they did. And then you stumbled upon this old prospector's hovel in this desolate canyon between two godforsaken towns. It must have seemed like the perfect place to hide out. I mean, it looks like he even had some like patio furniture, some cushions, you know, to sleep on. so he didn't have to lay on these hard rocks. Look, there's a pot here for cooking up a big old pot of beans, or I don't know, I guess it could have been used to cook meth. This could just be a meth squatter's camp, I don't know. It's just a theory. Curious to see what you guys think. This looks like it might have been some kind of old fireplace or hearth, you know? It's like a little grate on the front. He could have heated up his cans of beans here. You know those cans of beans he stole from all them volunteer cabins? Yes, pants. It's an old pair of cargo pants. Could these have been the Ballarat Bandits cargo pants? I don't know. Tag doesn't look that old. Athletic Works. I don't know. I mean, this would have been 20 years ago. I'm not sure these pants are 20 years old. They could be. I don't know. This is all just a theory. I'm not sure if this was actually a campsite of the Ballarat Bandit, or it could have just been some homeless squatters camp. But it's pretty far outside Pahrump, so I have a hard time imagining how homeless folk could get all the way out here and survive all the way out here. You know, they'd have to go back and forth into town to panhandle, and like I said, it's probably more than 15 miles, so homeless camp doesn't really make much sense to me. And then too, like, a lot of the stuff that's left here on the ground, like part of old jumper cables, it's like part of an old suitcase. Kind of seems like, you know, somebody stole somebody's suitcase and busted it open to get their food out or something. I don't know. It looks like there's just a lot of old, well, I was gonna say automotive parts, but look, here's somebody's comb. Oh no, the Ballarat Bandit's comb. Man, it's just like car parts and electronics part. Isn't that a fan out of a CPU? It's a mystery. And then there's some other stuff over here. Like here's the other half of the jumper cables. Then there's, I don't know, it's like a lot of old electronics cables. And when I say old, I mean old. Look at that. These old AV jacks. These look like they could be from 20 years ago. You know, like 20 years ago, they didn't even have smartphones. I mean, they had cell phones, but they didn't have smartphones. And a lot of the devices we have today, they didn't have back then. So they probably did have a lot of this old-timey, antiquated-looking cables and cords. Bundle of wire, like an old plug cutter. It almost looks like whoever was here was trying to make a bomb or something. Oh god, look at this. This is kind of creepy. There's a stick that has like tape wrapped around one end of it, like a handle, and then the other end has like an old shirt or something wrapped around it, kind of like a weapon. You know, like, rah, you could definitely beat off the police with something like this. Oh gosh, yikes, look at the size of that friggin' rat trap. Ugh, I hate to see the size of the rat that thing caught. But, you know, rat traps aside, there's busted pieces of like old camp gear. Matter of fact, back over here in the main cabin, which by the way, I just noticed there's even like little stairs going up to it. So this had to have been some old prospector camp originally. But back in the squatter camp, there's all these cushions, like these patio chairs that somebody would have been sleeping on. There's even like looks like there's an air mattress back there. I don't know, it's just a theory, but a lot of the stuff here does, like the timeline adds up. Like look at this thing. It's like some old, I guess it's like one of those insulated lunch bags you carry your lunch to work in, but it's like from some trade show or something. Nemes 2001. Okay, that totally fits in with the timeline of the Ballarat Bandit. They were looking for him in 03, 04. He would have been over here, I guess, in like summer of 04. So just a few years after that trade show. So I don't know, it makes sense to me that he would have stolen that insulated lunch bag. That insulated lunch bag probably came from the campers that he robbed out in over by Ballarat. You know, the people he stole their camping supplies. They probably had their lunch packed in there, and that was one of the things he took. If you're watching this video and the Ballarat Bandit did burgle you, and that was one of your lunch bags, let us know in the comments. Anyway, just kind of an unholy mess in here now, but I personally can see how this really wouldn't have been too bad of a place to hide out. You know, especially considering his other camps up in the Panama Mountains, I think were pretty rough. Like, he just had tarps, like a little bivouac situation. It wasn't anything fancy. This would have been like moving into a mansion. Actually, I don't mean to poke fun about any of this, because it's actually a really sad story, which I guess I should finish telling you the story of what happened to the Ballarat Bandit. So they found that yellow truck. He took off up in Johnson Canyon, disappeared again. But I guess like all his water and supplies were in that truck. And because he had to hightail it away from there, he wasn't able to take any water with him. And so it was July, so really hot in Death Valley. With no water, you're not going to last very long. And so just like, I think 4 days after that, on Highway 127, which is the highway that runs just along the eastern edge of Death Valley from the town of Shoshone all the way to Baker, California, home of the world's tallest thermometer. Well, right along that highway somewhere, some passing motorists happened to see a guy passed out at the side of the road by one of those emergency call boxes. And I guess the guy was naked. He had a tarp or something kind of covered him, and he had an empty gas can, and he was just laying there, not moving. So these motorists, they didn't want to stop and get involved, but they alerted the authorities. The cops came out, and as soon as they approached, they just knew, this is it, boys. It's the Ballarat Bandit. At last. I guess maybe they recognized the gas can. Somehow they knew it was him. And so, they probably got out of their SUVs with their guns drawn, and as they approached the man laying there at the side of the highway, I mean, he was completely wore out, this guy. And again, I have conflicting feelings about this story. Of course, I always root for the underdog, so it's like, yeah, man, go, escape the cops. Run, Ballarat Bandit, run! But then it's also like, well, I know Rock Novak, and I'm sure he needed that quad, Quads ain't cheap, and he's not a wealthy man, or even the people who own that Subaru that was stolen. You never know, that could have belonged to a single mom who needed that Subaru so she could get to work, and because she didn't have a way to get to work, she lost her job, and next thing you know, she lost custody of the kids, and it could have ruined her whole life. So I'm not really saying the Ballarat Bandit was a good guy, but he didn't hurt anybody. He was just petty theft here and there, and I do sort of feel sorry for him, and especially, he's been running for 4 days with no water. He's passed out naked at the side of the road. The cops are closing in on him, and this time he knows there's not going to be any escaping into any canyons. This time it's it. And so, sadly, he had that shotgun with him, and he pulled it out, and he blasted his head off right in front of the cops, which I'm sure was really horrifying for those officers, because I can't imagine what it would be like to see that up close. But it's just a terrible story all around, I feel weird doing these kinds of videos, like these true crime stories. And there's all these true crime channels that do this all day, every day. And in fact, there's a couple true crime channels that have the Ballarat Bandit as one of their episodes. I just feel kind of smarmy doing it because he's a real person. The victims were real people. The perpetrator was a real guy, but he had a family. He had a wife and he had 4 daughters. And when I tell you the rest of the story, well, you'll understand why I feel some kind of compassion for him. Whether or not he was squatting in this old rock prospector's hovel in this anonymous canyon just outside Pahrump or not, he was a person, he was a husband, and he was a father. And come to find out, it was a pretty sad backstory. Well, they didn't know who he was at all at first. They just knew they caught the Ballarat Bandit. And there was no ID, obviously he didn't have his ID on him. The only identifying information he had was he had a really crappy tattoo, like what they call a jailhouse tattoo. Because I guess if you go to jail, you can get like a homemade tattoo from your cellie with a sharpened, busted ballpoint pen. Your cellie can gouge a tattoo into your arm. Well, he had a real crappy Harley Davidson logo. I happen to be wearing a Harley Davidson shirt myself today. Anyway, this guy had a real crummy Harley Davidson tattoo, so they figure, okay, he was a biker, but he was probably in prison. And so his fingerprints are probably in the system somewhere. So they searched the whole database of all the fingerprints of everybody who'd ever been in prison in the United States, and nothing turned up. And it went on, I think, for like over a year. The coroner couldn't identify who this guy was. And, of course, they put out, they probably had a reconstructed photo of him that they sent out to everybody. If you recognize this man, call the authorities. Nobody called the authorities. Nobody recognized him. And so he ended up being buried in what they call a potter's grave. I guess it's just an unmarked free grave somewhere in San Bernardino County. And I think he might actually still be there to this day. Anyway, I guess after about a year, somebody suggested to the coroner that, well, you know what? Maybe he wasn't American. Those off-duty cops that talked to him said he looked American and he sounded American. Well, who looks American and sounds American but isn't American? Canadians. That's right, there's Canadians all over the desert. You know how those Canadian snowbirds are. They love the desert. You can't go to Death Valley in the wintertime without tripping over them every 50 feet. So now they sent the fingerprints, I guess, to the Canadian law enforcement, and sure enough, turned up in the prison records up there. It turned out his name was Robert Johnston. He was from Prince Edward Island, which is way, way over on the east side of Canada, and he had been busted for growing marijuana. It's actually a really sad story. So he was just kind of a blue-collar guy. He was a drywaller by trade. Married to this woman that he met at a biker bar. I think she used to be a stripper. And they had a wonderful relationship. He was a drywaller, but he didn't really want to... I think he just wanted to drop out of society. He was really into the desert and, prospecting for gold and looking for aliens and just wandering around the desert. And so for a long time, him and his wife actually did live off the grid in an RV in the U.S., in the desert. They just traveled around and camped out in these random canyons. And they even had their first baby. I think she gave birth to their first baby in the RV. I mean, they were hardcore off-grid. But I don't know if you read interviews with her. She said he was a wonderful man. He was a, free thinker, had all these ideas, wasn't a violent person. So they had 1 kid, 2 kids. I think by the 3rd kid, she was like, listen, we need to move back to Canada. We need a house. So they ended up back in Canada where, unfortunately, the wife was diagnosed with leukemia. And even though they have free healthcare in Canada, I guess the medical bills were racking up. And so Robbie, I guess he went by Robbie started growing weed in the backyard. And come to find out, he was pretty good at it. So he had this big marijuana grow. This would have been in the late 90s, I guess. And he was making pretty good money and supporting his wife and paying for her chemo treatments. But then one of his neighbors ratted him out to the police. I guess the neighbor's pig got in his backyard. And so the neighbor went in the backyard to get him out and saw all them pot plants and whoop, whoop, straight dropped a dime, called the police, ratted him out. Robert Johnson ended up getting 2 4-year sentences back to back, but he only served 1.5 years, although I guess that 1.5 years was really traumatic for him. His wife said he was never the same after he got out of prison. I guess they gave him some kind of antipsychotic meds that really messed him up, and then just the fact that he was locked up in prison when all he wanted to do was be roaming around the desert, that'd be enough to mess anybody up. And all of this over a marijuana conviction. To support your wife's chemo treatments on top of all of it. That's why I say this is a really sad story. So I guess after he got out of prison, he was never really able to get back into regular life, and he was having a real hard time adapting, struggling, having a lot of mental problems. And so he went down to the United States. He told his wife and his 4 daughters that he was going down to the U.S. to, I guess, see some kind of faith healer. And then I guess he kind of got this cockamamie idea that he would start a marijuana grow operation in the desert in Death Valley. Now, you might think that's completely insane. How would you be able to grow marijuana in an environment like this? It's hot, it's dry, there's no water, it's blasting heat every day. Well, you'd be surprised. Especially up in the Panamint Mountains, there's a lot of natural springs up there, and believe it or not, they do bust pretty big-scale marijuana grow operations up there all the time. Matter of fact, just a couple months ago, they busted a real big illegal grow in Jail Canyon in the Panamint Mountains. Happens all the time. So it's not that crazy of an idea. And I guess that's why when they found that yellow flatbed truck and almost caught him, remember I said there was those buckets with little marijuana seedlings under it? I think he was up in the mountains trying to start a grow operation so he could raise enough money to either bring his wife and daughters back down there with him or maybe go back up to be with them and have enough money to pay for his wife's medical treatments. I don't know. It's not like he was just stealing for the thrill of it. I mean, he had a legitimate reason, or I don't know. It sounds legitimate to me, but I don't know, man. I'm not sure what to make of this campsite situation. I mean, yeah, it sure would be interesting if this really was the Ballarat Bandits campsite. And part of the reason I think it might be is somebody told me that he had a campsite around here. So I don't know if he was camping around here and this little stone cabin was already here. Well, why not? Then again, there is that Jeep track leading right to it. And I feel like he was so wily, he wouldn't have camped anywhere where there was a road leading to it. He would have just squirreled himself away in some other random unmarked canyon. You know what I mean? Like, why make it easier for the cops than you have to, So my first thought when I stumbled on this lonely little campsite was, okay, it's probably just some old mine camp or prospector's camp. Because not only is there that one little cabin there's another really rough cabin up here. Just around the corner by that creepy cave where I stopped to take a break earlier, there's another really rough little stone enclosure. I wouldn't even go so far as to call it a cabin or a shelter. And you can see somebody was squatting in here too. There's a sleeping bag. It's like a busted wine bottle. Looks like somebody maybe had a campfire back there. So yeah, somebody was definitely squatting here in more recent times, but I don't know, the fact that there's 2 stone dwellings right in relatively close proximity, well, that made me think, okay, this is probably some kind of really, really rough mining camp. You know, you see these super rough mining camps all over the mountains out here. And then there's this like hole in the ground, which I thought at first might have been some kind of mine shaft, but it's really shallow unless it's just been filled in. And then I don't know, there's these two like telephone pole kind of things next to it. So it almost seems like there might have been a hoist or something on it at one time. So maybe this was some kind of a mine shaft, but it's pretty small for a mine. And there's no tailings pile anywhere near it. And there's no evidence of mining anywhere around here. You know, no tailings piles, no diggings. And actually, when I was here 3 years ago, I was curious. And I actually hiked all the way up to the very top of this formation. I hiked all around up there, and I didn't see any other signs of a mine camp. So if this was, my guess is it was some lonely little prospector camp, some 1 or 2 man operation, you know. George over here and Jim down there. You know, get together at night, drink beers, and get in fist fights, and then look for gold during the day. And then, you know, 150 years later, Ballarat Bandit, on the lam from the police, looking for a place to camp, rides his quad up this canyon late one summer evening. And he sees, you know, this is in the shade, and there's already this enclosure. And he thinks, oh, this would be a pretty good place to hide out. And so he hid out here long enough to steal that Subaru and then flee back over to the other side of Death Valley. I don't know. It's just a theory. You know how I'm always going into these abandoned places and speculating wildly about who might have lived there and what might have happened. And then, you know, at the end I go, oh, it's just a theory. Well, in this case, I feel like I am speculating relatively wildly, but not as wildly as I normally do. I feel like there's a semi-compelling case to be made that this could have been one of the Ballarat Bandits' campsites. So what do you think? Let us know in the comments below. Did the Ballarat Bandit actually camp out here? Or was it just some homeless meth heads from Pahrump? I personally can't decide.